Welcome to the first video overview of Module 5, the third act of the mind, reasoning. With this video, we commence with the third part of our course, that is reasoning. We covered apprehension, expressed in terms. We covered judgment, expressed in propositions. Now we will consider reasoning, which is expressed in arguments. Now terms, as we saw, could be either clear or unclear, propositions true or false. Arguments can be either valid or invalid. Arguments are neither true or false, only the propositions within them are, but an argument can be valid or invalid. Now, human reason surpasses animal intelligence in at least three ways. While human knowledge begins with experience, we can know things beyond our experience. As Krefft points out, if we know that everything that has atoms must be able to reflect light, and if we know that little green men on Mars have atoms, if there are little green men on Mars, they must have atoms, then we know with certainty that little green men on Mars, if there are any, must be able to reflect light, even though we have never seen little green men on Mars, and even though we do not know whether or not there are little green men on Mars. This, as Krefft notes, is quite remarkable. Second, we can know not just particular truths, but also universal truths. We can know that 2 plus 2 equals 4 applies to any two things combined with any other two things equals 4 things. And all men are mortal. This is also something that we can see as true of all individual human beings. Third, we can know necessary and unchangeable truths. So we can know that 2 plus 2 equals 4 is an absolutely necessary truth. Same thing that all triangles have 180 degrees in the sum of their 3 interior angles, no matter what the triangle is. So individual triangles may change out of wood or bronze or plaster. These may crumble or change or disintegrate, but the truth itself about triangles does not. Thus, we have certain foundational principles of reasoning. Whatever is universally true of a subject must be true of everything contained in the subject. That is, if X must be true of all S, then X must be true of every single X. This is the dictum de omni. So, for example, we can be certain that all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates must be mortal. Whatever is true of a universal is true of all its instances, for a universal is a universa, one in many, one and the same in all instances. 2. Whatever is universally false of a subject must be false of everything contained in that subject. This is the dictum de nullo. And of course, this is just the reverse of the first principle. Because of this principle, we can be certain that no men are angels. Socrates is a man. Socrates must not be an angel. 3. Two things identical with one and the same third thing are identical with each other. This third thing is the middle term. So, if Socrates and mortal are both compared with a common third term, middle term, men, or human beings, if all men are mortal, all human beings are mortal, and Socrates is a human being, then Socrates must be mortal. 4. Inversely, if two things are not identical with one and the same third thing, then they are not identical with each other. So in the syllogism, or basic argument, no men are angels, and Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is not an angel. Socrates and angel are both compared with the common third term or middle term, men. 5. The law of identity. A thing is what it is. And the negative corollary is a thing is the law of non-contradiction, the negative of the law of identity. A thing is not what it isn't. X is not non-X. And then 7, which is the law of excluded middle, a thing is either X or not X. Or something cannot be both X and non-X in the same way and at the same time. Tautologies. A tautology is a proposition that does not need to be proved because it is logically self-evident. It proves itself, so to speak. Thus, all LaSalle students are students. Nothing that is divisible is indivisible at the same time. Whatever animal has teeth and claws has claws. This candidate will be elected if he has enough support, etc. Some propositions may be self-evident objectively, but not so subjectively. Angels are not confined to space is self-evident to a theologian or metaphysician, but not to others. Photons have no mass is self-evident to physicists, but not to non-physicists. In short, tautologies are propositions that give us no new information. The predicate is essentially the same as the subject. Tautologies are necessarily true. Their contradictories are necessarily false. Other propositions are only contingently true or false. We cannot imagine or conceive the opposite of a necessary truth. We can do so, however, of contingent truths. So, for example, we cannot imagine that 2 plus 2 equals 5. And yet, we can imagine a situation in which water doesn't flow downhill. So, for example, out in space, on a planet with little or no gravity, water would dissipate. It would not flow downhill. So, certain physical laws are contingent upon, for example, the conditions upon Earth, and so forth. Whereas certain logical and mathematical truths are not contingent upon anything, and these are necessary. How to detect arguments. In order to test any argument as to whether it is sound or not, we must do 3 things. 1. Detect the presence of an argument. 2. Get clear about what the argument is saying, and we do this by putting it into logical form. 3. We must determine whether the argument is valid or not. There are 2 things that will indicate whether an argument is present. 1. The structure. The essential structure of an argument consists in a relationship between its 2 parts, premises and a conclusion. This can be put in different ways, often with the conclusion being stated first, and then the reasons, premises, for this conclusion being given. Here are some key words to help you detect the presence of an argument. Conclusion words: therefore, hence, it follows that, consequently, which shows that, so, then, indicates that, implies that, entails that, thus, as a result, accordingly, for this reason, etc. Premise words: because, since, for, as, on the assumption that, if we assume that, if we suppose that, in view of the fact that, let us assume that, may be inferred from, may be deduced from, follows from, as shown by, inasmuch as, the reason is that, for the reason that, for this reason, etc. One of the things we must get clear on is the difference between an argument and an explanation. Compare the following using Kreft's example. He must be guilty because he has shifty eyes. He is absent because he is ill. The first statement is a very weak argument, while the second one is an explanation. The second statement is an explanation because we are not trying to prove the conclusion. He is absent. The conclusion is not in doubt. I do not have to give reasons to support it. I am simply explaining why he is absent. In the first statement, the conclusion is in doubt and controversial. I am giving a reason as to why you should agree that he must be guilty. I am not giving a very good reason, but it is an argument along the lines of the following syllogism. Some who have shifty eyes are guilty, and he has shifty eyes, therefore he is guilty. Truth and validity. As we saw before, arguments are either valid or invalid. If an argument is invalid, it contains a fallacy, or a mistake in reasoning. By contrast, it is only propositions that are true or false, and terms that are clear or ambiguous. So a good argument is one in which the terms are clear, the proposition is true, and the reasoning is valid. Truth is a relationship between a proposition and the real world or objective reality. Validity is a relationship between 2 or more propositions. A valid argument gives certainty about its conclusion. It is not an absolute, but relative certainty. It is certain relative to the truth of the premises. If any one of the premises is false, then even a valid argument is a bad argument. Thus, there are 4 possibilities in any argument. 1. The premises are true and the argument is valid. 2. The premises are true and the argument is invalid. 3. At least one of the premises is false and the argument is valid. 4, at least one of the premises is false and the argument is invalid. So, only the two following inferences are correct. 1, if the argument is valid and the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. This is arguing forward. 2, if the argument is valid and the conclusion is false, then at least one premise must be false. This is arguing backward. Here are examples of valid arguments with false premises but a true conclusion. All evil spirits are birds, and all sparrows are evil spirits, therefore all sparrows are birds. 2, the earth is a star, and no stars are fish, therefore the earth is not a fish. There are 8 takeaways from this. 1, you do not prove that a premise is true by showing that from it a true conclusion follows. 2, you do not prove that a conclusion is false by showing that it follows from a false premise. 3, you do prove that a premise is false by showing that from it a false conclusion validly follows. 4, you do prove that a conclusion is true by showing that it validly follows from true premises. 5, you do not prove that a conclusion is false by showing that the argument is invalid. An invalid argument can have a true conclusion. For example, the sky is blue and grass is green, therefore man is mortal. This has a true conclusion, but doesn't follow from the premises. It's also a non sequitur. 6, you do not prove that an argument is invalid by showing that its conclusion is false. All pigs are purple, and all purple things are immortal, therefore all pigs are immortal is a perfectly valid argument, but with all false premises and a false conclusion. 7, you do not prove the conclusion is true by showing that the argument is valid. The premises must also be true. Finally, you do not prove an argument valid by showing that its conclusion is true. You can have a true conclusion coming from a completely invalid argument. Thus concludes our first overview of Module 5. Thank you.